Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Jordan Rutter, Director of Communications at American Bird Conservancy. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel afterwards. We'll be putting links in the chat, but in case you missed them or can't copy them down fast enough, please know that everything can be found in a follow-up email we'll send to registrants and on our website. Please submit any questions you have during the presentations using the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many of those as we can during the webinar and definitely in the Q&A portion at the end. Automated captions are available for this webinar, and you can turn them on by clicking on the up arrow next to the CC icon, then click on Show Subtitles. You can then drag them wherever you want on the screen. Before we begin, I want to share some background on American Bird Conservancy, shortened to ABC, which was founded in 1994 with the mission of protecting wild birds and their habitats across the Americas. We continue that work today following a conservation strategy outlined by the pyramid featured on the current slide. Our work strives to help keep common birds common and prevent the rarest birds from going extinct. And bird conservation works. Species and groups of birds have rebounded in the past decades, but it doesn't happen without people like you who care about birds. So thank you again for joining our webinar. Like us, birds need a safe place to call home. Sadly, habitat loss is the most urgent threat facing wild birds today, as more than half of all bird species in the Americas are suffering population declines. More than 2.9 billion breeding adult birds have disappeared since 1970 in the US and Canada alone. And this means that displaced birds like the ones you'll learn about today are even more at risk. ABC relies on support from generous bird enthusiasts and conservationists like you to power our projects like the ones featured in this webinar. As you learn about how ABC is conserving bird habitats and combating daily threats to birds in the most effective ways possible, please consider making a donation to support these critical efforts. Every dollar raised will count towards our Habitat is Home one-to-one match to raise a combined $1 million for wild bird conservation across the Americas by January 1st. Visit abcbirds.org/helphabitat or scan the QR code on today's slides to make a gift. Thank you so much for caring about birds, and a special shout out and thank you to all the ABC members and donors in the audience right now. I hope you enjoy seeing the incredible conservation efforts that you're helping make possible. So I'll admit that I have daydreamed for a while now about a Caribbean vacation where I get to observe flamingos in the wild. Never did I ever imagine my lifer, the first time I ever observed that species, would be in rural Pennsylvania alongside Amish, Mennonite, and dozens of other people. What an experience, though, and all thanks to these rare birds for being in the area. Rare birds can be thrilling and definitely generate a lot of buzz among birders, but it's really important to remember that they're more than just a tick on your checklist. They're an important conversation starter for several reasons, including the point about habitat conservation. The flamingos that I got to chase weren't in a Target parking lot, but a farm pond because that most resembled their natural habitat to them. Whether birds are where they're supposed to be or going or blown far off course, habitat is literally vital. And having places where both expected and unexpected species can eat and rest safely is critical. It's a home away from home if needed. And the presentations in this webinar will explain more and include ways that we can all take actions to help birds. So let me introduce you to our speakers. Today we have Daniel Lebbin joining us, who is Vice President of Threatened Species at ABC. Daniel received a BA in Biology and Environmental Science and Policy from Duke University and a PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Cornell University. He has worked for World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and the National Zoo, and participated in field research projects in Jamaica, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Venezuela. A lifelong birder, Daniel enjoys bird illustration and photography, and he co-authored the American Bird Conservancy Guide to Bird Conservation. McKeon is ABC's Marine Program Director. He's a biodiversity scientist and natural historian focused on the conservation of marine ecosystems. An avid and enthusiastic conservationist and science communicator, he has participated in expeditions to remote reaches of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean basins, investigating the response of global diversity to environmental challenges. And last but not least, we have Chloe Dannenfelser, who is our Texas Coastal Outreach Coordinator for American Bird Conservancy, and she oversees the outreach aspects of SPLASH, Stopping Plastics and Litter Along Shorelines program. Chloe earned a degree in wildlife and fisheries sciences from Texas A&M University and has a background in research, extension programming, and environmental education. First up, we'll have Dan present. So Dan, if you want to get set up.
Okay, can everyone see my first slide?
Wonderful, take it away.
Great, thank you, Jordan. Well, I think to start this conversation today, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about vagrancy in birds, which is essentially what causes birds to move places they don't usually occur. I'll also talk a little bit about why water birds make for great vagrants. And I think one of the common questions that a lot of people have are, do vagrants survive and return to where they belong? So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll conclude with if any of this really matters and the conservation perspective and what we can all do to help. Okay. So one of the main causes of vagrancy in birds is drift. And so a lot of vagrant birds are involving migratory birds. And so drift is what happens when a storm or inclement weather takes migratory birds that are in the process of migrating and puts them off course. In the case of the flamingos that we're all enjoying and talking about, a lot of people think that Hurricane Idalia, when it was passing through the Caribbean in late August, early September, it went right through the straits between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba, which is also a migratory pathway for flamingos. And we think what happened was there were flocks of flamingos flying across the ocean at this point in time, and they got diverted and drifted off course because of this hurricane into the continental United States. So this is a common form or cause of vagrancy. Another pathway or mechanism that vagrancy occurs, particularly in young birds, birds that are perhaps hatchier birds and haven't migrated before, is what I think of as mistaken programming. So there's a phenomenon of reverse migration as well as mirror image migration. And so what happens with reverse migration is that the bird heads off at the right time, but it heads off in exactly opposite the wrong direction, 180 degrees. So that'll result in a bird maybe heading north instead of south, and that can result in vagrancy. Likewise, mirror image migration happens when a bird heads off in exactly the opposite direction across the north-south axis. So instead of heading maybe southwest as it should, it heads southeast. So this can happen often with young birds in their first migration. Then there's some other forms or mechanisms that can convert migratory birds into vagrants. Overshooting is simply the bird goes too far, much farther than it was expecting to, or most of the other birds go. Dispersal tends to happen when, again, young birds are spreading out from where they hatch, and they can go in often random directions, but often don't go that far from where they came from. And then last is association, which is particularly common with water birds and flocking species, where a bird will join a flock of another species and then go along with that species and their migratory pathway, as illustrated here with this common crane, which bred in Asia and then joined a flock of sandhill cranes. Instead of migrating south in Asia, migrated south in North America. So why water birds? Why are water birds such great vagrants? Well, they're adapted to dispersing to track the appearance and disappearance of wetlands, which are often ephemeral habitats. So they're used to moving around. Many water birds are also long distance migrants. So they encounter opportunities to go off course because of storms or other reasons. And then finally, they often travel in flocks, either flocks of their own kind or mixed species flocks like this group of shorebirds here, which are really powerful flyers, fly long distances, and often congregate and mix in terms of mixed species flocks. So a lot of people wonder, do vagrants survive and do they get back to where they came from? And we suspect that a lot of them die. We know some of them do. Unfortunately, one of the two flamingos that Jordan saw in Pennsylvania, we know got bitten by a snapping turtle. It was rescued by wildlife rehabbers, And in the process of caring for it and trying to transport it to a better facility, unfortunately, it did pass away. We also know some vagrant birds live, sometimes for years after they're first spotted, without returning to where they came from. One of the most famous examples of this right now in North America is a stellar sea eagle that was first spotted in Alaska in August of 2020, then was seen briefly in Texas, and then made its way up to New England and Eastern Canada. And it's still being seen as of this summer and late fall in Eastern Canada. Who knows where it might go next? So in terms of whether these birds will return, I personally think that the flamingos probably will, in many cases, return back to where they're from. I think they're making their way now. They're certainly taking their time. We don't know. It's an ongoing story that we'll find out to see what happens. The stellar sea eagle seems to be settling into a new pattern of migration between New England in the winter and Eastern Canada in the summer. We'll see. But again, like Jordan said, habitat is home, even when it's home away from home. And so it's really important to have safe resting and refueling places for these birds. So does any of this matter? Do vagrants matter? For birders, vagrants matter a lot. It's part of birding culture to go chase these birds. It gives people opportunities to see them when they might not otherwise have the opportunity to travel to their more typical locations. It's also important for researchers who study migration. By understanding how migration can go awry or go off course, it helps people understand how migration works and how birds are orienting and navigating. And then finally, over the history of time and evolution, vagrancy is really important because it can lead to range expansions. It can lead to the establishment of new populations and even the evolution of new species. So here we show a Lebbin duck. It's endemic to the Hawaiian Islands. And along with the Hawaiian duck, we're almost certainly derived from vagrant colonizing mallards to the Hawaiian Islands. So this is my last slide and about conservation, what we can do. I think birders can certainly enjoy the presence of vagrants and engage birders in that conversation about conservation. And this photo is from when I went to Chincoteague to see a flamingo. And I set up a scope at kid level height. And a lot of other kids and passerbyers and non-birders were very excited to see the flamingo. I didn't have to identify it for them. They all knew what a flamingo was and what it would look like. And they really enjoyed that opportunity. Vagrants are kind of a numbers game. And it's really important that we have healthy and resilient bird populations that will produce vagrants, as well as survive the losses and deaths of vagrants when those occur. So again, conserving habitat and reducing threats, especially along coasts where vagrants most likely appear, but also in people's yards, and keeping cats indoors and reducing threats from pesticides and window collisions, all of that can help vagrants and resilient populations of birds.
Thanks so much, Dan. I know we could talk about this for hours, so we will definitely come back to you at the Q&A at the end. But next up is C, who's going to talk about seabirds specifically. So C, if you want to get set up.
How does that look, Jordan?
You're good to go.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. I run the marine program for ABC, and we have three main things that we focus on. We focus on finding and securing nesting places for rare and endangered seabirds. We work on sustainable seascapes. So how do we make resources available for marine birds and people? And then we look for kinship. We look for those little bits of connection between marine birds and human culture and activity. And this work is important in a number of ways. But one way to think about it is that we know that seabirds are in decline. 70% declines in seabird populations between 1950 and 2010. These birds are literally sliding off the graph. And the reasons behind that decline are apparent. Many islands where these birds nest have introduced mammal predators such as cats or rats and mice. With global change and sea level rise, many of the nesting islands are actually being submerged. So the entire populations of birds are losing limited nesting spaces as they exist now. And unlike some species of birds that are smaller or have restricted ranges or live in a very particular area, these birds live in entire oceanic ecosystems, and there's no way that we can have them reproduce or assist them reproducing in places like captivity. There's no global terrarium for an ocean ecosystem or an island nesting ground. But what seabirds do have going for them is their capacity for travel. So these are the tracks from sooty shearwaters originating in New Zealand. You can see that these birds make it all the way up to the extreme coast of North America, up there in Alaska, as well as Northern Asia. Some go and visit Chile and Peru off of South America. Some even make it into the Atlantic and do a whole nother series of looping pathways across 2 ocean basins. These birds travel on a level that is unlike any other species except perhaps our own. And they show up in unexpected places. So the bottommost bird in this photograph is a great shearwater, an Atlantic species. And this photograph was taken in Monterey Bay. You can see just above it are some of the locals. In this case, pink-footed shearwaters, which nest in Chile. And then above them, Buhler shearwaters that nest in New Zealand. Same thing happens sometimes in the Atlantic. So here's a short-tailed shearwater photographed off of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Short-tails are normally, again, a New Zealand nester that makes it up to Arctic Canada and Alaska in the Pacific Basin, but they can travel. Even some smaller birds that might be familiar to you, like puffins and murrelets, routinely make passages from one ocean basin to the other. So here, tufted puffin in yellow and long-billed murrelet in green and ancient murrelet in purple are all shown with their appearances over the last couple decades within the Atlantic Basin. One rock star among seabird vagrants has been the Northern Gannet. And this is a spectacular seabird, about a 6-foot wingspan, ranges broadly across the North Atlantic as far as its breeding grounds and its wintering grounds. But in 2011, 3 were seen off the northwest coast of Alaska. By 2012, 1 had established itself on the islands off of California. And that bird is still being seen as of this September. So Morris has another seabird advantage, and that's a long lifespan. So there's the potential for seabirds to exist for decades in a new location, waiting for another member of their species to show up to potentially mate and start a new population. And that pattern has repeated multiple times. So some lucky birds have been able to find new habitats in remote places that they were initially vagrants to. So Manx shearwater, a North Atlantic breeder, can now be found, we think, in British Columbia. We find them up and down the Pacific. Swinhoe storm petrel, a North Asian breeder, is now found in the Selvagem Islands in the North Atlantic. An elegant tern from the west coast of North America is now found breeding in Spain. What this should mean to you is that when we're considering the conservation actions we take for seabirds, we need to protect not just the extant places, the places that we already know seabirds breed, but also the possible places from factors such as introduced mammal predators and sea level rise. So how do we go about doing that? Well, ABC is actively trying to create safe places for seabirds to breed. And one way that we go about doing this is something as simple as building fences. So this is Nihoku in the Kilauea Point National Wildlife Refuge in Kauai, Hawaii. And this was a multi-partner project and initiated more than 10 years ago now. But the goal originally was to bring Hawaiian petrel and Newell shearwater, two endangered species, to nest in this protected space. And that's successful. Those birds are now breeding and returning as new adults to this area. But some other birds started showing up as well. So Bulwer's petrel is now breeding in Nihoku, and Bulwer's nests in Hawaii sometimes. And then Kermadec petrel, and this is unusual. Kermadec petrel is a southern hemisphere breeder, yet they can be seen courting and running around on the ground in Nihoku, this protected space. If recorded, Kermadec petrel in Nihoku would be the first record of a northern hemisphere breeding of this species. We're trying to repeat this pattern. So we're working on a new preserve called Mokio Preserve on Molokai. And we're going to try to do the same thing, introduce not just a singular species, but an entire community of seabirds. And what is interesting here as well is that we're not just, or we and our partners are not just working on seabirds, but this is a true ecosystem restoration. So we have partners working on the terrestrial vegetation and even pollinators such as the endangered yellow-faced bee. These ecosystem connections are a vital part of our understanding of how seabirds play a role in larger terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems. So when we think of tropical islands, you're probably thinking of things like palm trees or coconut trees. It turns out that coconut trees, while iconic, are introduced in many places. If we remove coconut palms and reintroduce native vegetation such as Pisonia, we can end up with islands that are more like seabird habitat originally, and we can call these seabird forests. And these seabird forests bring back seabirds in numbers. And these aren't always the rare birds. These might be common birds like terns or boobies, but they're important in unusual ways that we're just starting to understand. They deposit nutrients, they deposit marine nutrients on land, and that slow passage of nutrients from the land into nearshore systems increases plankton numbers, increases coral reef growth, increases fisheries that are then harvestable by humans. So a few takeaways here. Seabirds are in catastrophic decline, yet capable of tremendous movement in response to change or maybe whim, many of the examples that Dan gave. Some of those opportunistic voyages result in successful colonizations, but the process is dependent on safe breeding habitat in both historic and new locations. And seabird restoration has benefits to both ecosystems and human economy through things like fisheries. So while wandering seabirds might be the start of a new story, the positive outcomes are dependent on bold, creative approaches to conservation of habitat. And I'd like to say thank you for all of you who support our work. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, C. I know we'll be excited to talk to you more in the Q&A, but up next is Chloe, who is going to help share what all of us can do for birds, whether they're displaced or not. So Chloe, if you want to get set up, your screen looks great.
Thank you. All right, is my video on? Oh,
Yep, you're good. Take it away.
awesome. Howdy, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Chloe Dannenfelser. I'm the Texas Coastal Outreach Coordinator over here on the Gulf Coast. And we're going to talk about what ABC is doing for helping displaced birds. So all coasts along the Central Flyway are supercritical habitat, and these coasts are often hotspots for vagrants. So Texas is also extra important for all birds. More than 600 species have been identified here, and that's the second most of any state. And where I work is over on Galveston Island, and Galveston is right in the middle of the Mississippi and Central Flyway. So all these migrating birds are flying over us. And in fact, on April 27th of this year, we had 4.8 million birds pass through, which was the biggest of the year, according to Birdcast. But unfortunately with that, Texas is the trashiest state. We have the highest average weight of trash debris per mile, and trash accumulates on our coast 8 times faster than other states. This is due to several reasons. The currents in the Gulf kind of push all the trash up to us. We also have the Galveston Bay watershed, which actually starts up in Dallas and Fort Worth. So all that litter and runoff gets pushed all the way through Houston and then Galveston, and that's, you know, half of the state's population right there. So we're getting a lot of trash, not to mention debris from cargo ships in the Houston ship channel. So what does that mean for the birds? Shorebirds are some of the fastest declining groups of birds. This is due to habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and habitat degradation. So that means, you know, pollution and trash. And plastic pollution plays a huge part in this. They can get entangled. Like you can see here are some terns that were trying to incubate their nests. And here's a nest that was made with net, which is so sad. Let's see what's next. So the perils of plastic. It can harm wildlife in 2 main ways, which is ingestion and entanglement. So when it's ingested, the plastic can cut up the soft tissue and really damage their organs. It can also accumulate in their stomach. It doesn't, you know, break down. So it'll just build up and up in their stomach, and it'll lead to them starving because they're getting no real nutrition. Shorebirds and wading birds with those long legs are also like super susceptible to getting caught in discarded fishing line and nets. And those are things that are super common on beaches, not to mention like 6-pack rings and stuff like that. So you can see here is an American oyster catcher that is tangled up in some monofilament. And this can lead to injuries to the birds, like cuts, infections. They're easier to get caught by predators if they can't get away. And sometimes it'll cause them to lose circulation in their limbs and they'll lose it, which is so sad. So ABC is helping shorebirds, native birds, and migrating birds through the SPLASH program. So SPLASH is the Stopping Plastics Litter Along Shorelines program, and it is ABC's boots on the ground program that strives to make the Texas coast a safer place for people, birds, and other wildlife. We are a partner group with the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, Black Cat GIS, and of course, American Bird Conservancy. And we were started back in 2020 when all these staff biologists and ecologists noticed all these injured and dead shorebirds on the beaches of Galveston. So here we are. We do beach cleanups and education. And so far, we have removed over 36,000 pounds of trash. And that's from Galveston beaches, the ship channel. We go up into the Houston bayous and all kinds of waterways. And yeah, it's really fun. We have some great volunteers, as you can see here. We also do outreach and education, and we've been able to reach more than 12,000 people, which I'm super proud of since we're a pretty new organization. So we host monthly cleanups throughout our area, and we also do private cleanups. So we are often approached by school groups, university clubs, scout groups, church groups that need a service project. Sometimes even local businesses will want to offer volunteer days for their staff. So we set it up and we bring the gear, we get permission from the landowners, and we take the trash away when it's done. So we make it as easy as possible for people to help birds. While we're there, we also do transect surveys where we line out 100 feet of wherever we are. We collect all the trash and then we sort it by type and like what it is. And then we enter that into the Texas litter database, plus our own GIS map, but you can see we're doing some sorting here. And the goal of that is to target trash hotspots and see where certain kinds of trash are most commonly found. For example, we have a certain area that we find a ton of discarded fishing line at. So our goal is to one day go to the landowner and say, hey, we found this many pounds of fishing line. Could we help you invest in a trash management plan, such as like a fishing line recycling tube or more signage to educate anglers? So yeah, that's our trash management practices, which are super fun. So how can you help the birds? An easy way is to skip the single-use plastics. There are so many great reusable options out there, like water bottles or grocery bags. I keep reusable cutlery in my bag and truck, so I'm always ready to go. Because whenever you get takeout, they have those little plastic single-use cutlery. Those are an easy ones to swap out. Another option that's kind of cool and new, maybe y'all have heard about this, I'm just kind of learning about it, but zero waste refilleries are places where you go bring a jar or whatever container you want and you fill it up with like laundry detergent, dishwashing soap, cleaning supplies, and that way you can just go back and refill and not have to buy from the store where everything comes in plastic. So that's kind of new, might be in your area, worth checking out. And of course, you can always help a little bit. So next time you go to the beach or a park or anywhere out in nature, maybe just take a minute to clean up your area and leave it better than you found it. If everyone did a little bit every day, it really would go a long way to help the birds that live in your area or could just be passing through. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chloe. That was great. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen and welcome Dan and C to come back on camera. We have a very active audience, which is much appreciated, and we're going to get through a lot of these questions. So while we get oriented right now, because again, I want to make sure we take the chat into consideration, Dan, can we go back and do a little bit more definition clarity? We've had questions from registration and in the chat regarding the difference between a vagrant versus eruption versus range expansion. So those are three similar but different things. So would you mind clarifying, please?
Sure. I think a vagrant simply is a bird occurring where it's not usually occurring. So very irregularly in a place where it usually isn't observed. And what were the three again? So vagrant, eruption,
and then range expansion.
Okay, so eruption is a regular phenomena where birds essentially extend, usually seasonally, their winter range. So we see this happening with winter finches, with owl populations, and those seem to track resources. So either there's a resource shortage on the wintering grounds, or this is following a really good productive year where there's just extra birds around and they need to go a little further than they did before to find food. So this is a regular phenomena, but it's not an annual phenomena. And then range expansions can happen via vagrancy, but usually they're much more incremental and gradual and slower. And so we're seeing with climate change and with other mechanisms, birds just extending their range. And so they become regular where they are extending their range. And so how you decide when something is a range expansion versus a vagrant is a little bit of a gray area. We had a question about that. And so I think there's some examples with like wintering hummingbirds or wintering painted buntings, and, outside their historical ranges that we've observed. Those, I think, are new patterns that have emerged. And I think it's a judgment call, but I would personally consider some of those not to be vagrants really anymore, but new patterns.
Dee, would you mind chiming in just as a follow-up regarding the difference between an individual and a population or just a large group? Going back to this range expansion specifically, how do you know what to really focus on for conservation efforts, or what people should really care about when it's, one versus many?
It's a hard question. And it's going to vary from species to species. There are a few factors, though, as far as how do you define a population? Well, you can say a population consists of breeding individuals of a species. So that requires, in birds at least, two, and then go from there. So of the birds that I've been speaking about in this presentation, the elegant terns in Spain, for example, we know that they've been there for more than a decade. There's still only about 10 adult individuals. So does that count as a population? It's on the low end of things. The other factor that needs to be weighed in is that populations by themselves, just like individuals, are not stable. Populations can flicker out like a candle flame. And it's that variability, that element of chance, that makes these stable places, these protected spaces, homes away from home, important. It increases the chances of survival of a newly born population.
Thanks, C. So we've had Dan and C talk about the bird aspect of range expansion. Chloe, can you talk about the trash expansion? Can you go back and clarify why you say Texas is the trashiest?
Yes, absolutely. So according to a report in 2017 from the Ocean Conservancy and NOAA, so Texas, the litter accumulates faster because of the Gulf Coast currents. The litter kind of gets pushed up from other countries right to us. And also, like I said, the runoff from the Galveston watershed starts up in Dallas and Fort Worth. And I didn't know this before this job, but a lot of times trash isn't always put there on purpose. Sometimes poor trash cans or just, bad management gets it accidentally dumped into nature, and then the wind and the rain, it just pushes it into the local creek or a river or whatever, and it runs all the way down to us. So it's not even always on purpose. Also, I mean, a raccoon could get in there and start throwing stuff around in the cans. So like here in Galveston on the beach, the trash cans they're open, and all it takes is a raccoon to empty it, or the wind. So it's not always intentional.
Thanks, Chloe. So given the trash, and you just mentioned the Gulf current and everything, humans can have an impact on places and birds that we aren't near geographically. Let's flip the script and go back to the birds. Dan, would you mind taking the first answer at, do birds have an impact on places where they are vagrants? Given that ecosystems are so set up and valuable or vulnerable to things, do these vagrants have an impact on the birds and places where they're found?
I think that in small numbers, their impact is probably similarly small. In terms of history and the things that C was talking about, if those Kermadec petrels start nesting in this Nahoku fenced area and their population increases, then their ecological impact will increase as well, and I think in a positive way. So in terms of, someone asked also, do these vagrants become invasive? And I can't think of any examples in modern history where we really think of invasive species causing problems for conservation. But like in deep evolutionary time, for sure, there were range expansions of birds that likely would have caused competition or disruption in the bird communities that they were encountering. All of the passerines essentially evolved. The baseline passerines evolved in the Southern Hemisphere, basically left Australia and New Guinea, and then invaded the rest of the world. And surely there were other birds that were doing some similar things that maybe got displaced.
Thanks, Dan. C, do you want to chime in and just help reiterate the difference between these historic population locations for the birds and them being brought back compared to this invasive concern?
Yeah, I think the method of establishment is a bit of a gray zone for some things. So some birds have made it to North America on their own. Mostly, there's this idea of ship assist for cattle egret. So cattle egret was originally, at least cattle egret in North America, originated in Africa. And they made an Atlantic crossing to Brazil. And then from Brazil, they expanded northward at a good clip, taking advantage of human modified habitats. So that was certainly a tremendous range expansion, potentially aided by humans, but I wouldn't classify them as invasive. They are doing it on their own. There are questions for individuals, though, in terms of vagrants. You can imagine that a top level predator, think of our Steller sea eagle. If Steller sea eagles were to establish themselves in Eastern North America, would that have an impact on the local ecosystems? Possibly, perhaps even probably. I mean, that is a large apex predator being introduced to a system. Most birds don't fall into that apex predator category. So the effects are going to be smaller and harder to notice, at least at first. Numbers make all the difference here as well.
Thanks, C. So now I want to talk about what can people do for those vagrants again? What is our impact directly? So Dan and C, I know that you have chased birds as well. So what can people do to help minimize the stress and the impact on these birds, since they're so exciting to see? Dan, do you want to share, since you mentioned your Chincoteague flamingo?
Sure. Yeah. As a bird watcher, I love chasing birds that either I haven't seen before or that might be new for my state or ABA North America list. The flamingo, I couldn't chase the one in Pennsylvania near you, Jordan, but I got another chance with the Chincoteague bird, and it was just a great excuse to get down to the coast and be in a beautiful place and see that bird along with many other birds.
C, do you have anything to add?
My most recent chase of a vagrant species was large-billed tern, which is normally seen in the Amazon region. And there are two individuals that showed up in Florida. And we're not entirely sure if this is tied to the El Nino pattern that's establishing itself this year, or some other change in where the water is lying on a landscape. But they fit in quite well in the tern populations here in Florida. And so they were hanging out with Caspian terns and sandwich terns and gull-billed terns. And yeah, it was just a thrill to see this bird so far from where they were originally called home.
Well, let me ask you both. You didn't get close to these birds though, right? Both Dan's picture and the one on my slide earlier, we use scopes to make sure that we don't impact the comfort zone, so to speak, of these birds. And I recognize that chasing birds has its pros and cons, but right now the pros really are that conversation starter, that ability to have a community coming together event to celebrate birds, but also talk about conservation. C and Dan, would you agree?
I would agree. And I think one of the neat things about birds altogether, as well as vagrant birds, is that they connect geographies in a way unlike anything else on the planet. So the fact that I could have a conversation with a bunch of other Floridians about this large-billed tern that had come from South America and talk about, well, what are wetlands like in South America right now? What are wetlands like in Florida right now? That those tools for conversation become part of the key.
Dan, do you have anything to add?
I think you both said it pretty well.
But that brings us back to Chloe, because obviously, again, these rare birds are a great news clip, right? They bring attention and everything, but we also need to help and celebrate the birds that are around us every day, right? Even the common ones in our backyard that we shouldn't take for granted. So Chloe, do you have any tips for us in terms of how to share about splash and trash and ways we can help birds with others in our community?
Absolutely. Even though there may not be a splash program near you, I always say to lead by example. So whenever you go grocery shopping, carry all those bags, even though it makes you look crazy. Like, for example, my mom never did that, but after this job, I was like, hey, you got to do it. And she's like, you're right. And so now here she is, brought the whole family, taking her, 10 bags to the store, So again, just if you start by making these changes, other people around you will notice and ask questions, and you can tell them why. And, maybe they'll do it too.
Thanks, Chloe. So one of the other things too that really emphasizes is that we all need to be responsible for our own actions and impact, right? So taking action on trash is actually a really valuable and valid thing to do to help birds, right? One of the things that has come up a lot in, again, registration and the chat is, should we save these vagrant birds? Should we actually go and capture them and return them home? Dan and C, do you have any thoughts on, Yeah,
so I put a comment in the chat. Basically, vets and wildlife medical professionals usually like to have a no harm principle, do no harm. And so if the bird is healthy, it's probably the most prudent thing to leave it alone. because capturing it and moving it could stress it out. You risk harming the bird. If the bird is injured or otherwise looks like it's stressed or in distress, then that might be the right time to bring in a wildlife rehabilitator.
I want to add too that it's really important to remember the training and permitting that goes into interacting with wild birds. So while we acknowledge and are grateful for everyone's well intentions, it's really important to let professionals be the ones that actually are involved with wild birds. Again, even if you see a bird tangled in plastic, as Chloe showed in those pictures, please, there are resources online available for contacting wildlife rehabbers that will actually be most equipped for helping that bird directly. Great. Again, thank you so much to our audience for being very engaged. There's a lot of questions. Okay, so the other question I wanted to ask too was regarding other actions. Again, thank you so much, Chloe, for highlighting trash, but are there other actions that all three of you, Dan, maybe you want to talk first, since you mentioned it on your last slide, about ways to help birds around our home, especially given that there can be rare birds such as hummingbirds that come to backyards.
Sure. So for a lot of these vagrant birds, particularly along coasts, making sure that they have habitat, which originally is intended for the regular occurring birds, but these double as habitat for vagrant birds. So national wildlife refuges are really important in other reserves. But then people in there, so you can buy duck stamps that help the National Wildlife Refuge system. And you can also restore habitat in your own yards, whether that be that farm pond in Pennsylvania or backyards, wherever they may occur, by planting native plants, reducing pesticide usage or not using pesticides at all. ABC has programs to reduce window collisions. A lot of these migratory birds, even if they're not vagrants, they are encountering windows during inclement weather, and that can result in mortality events like what we saw in Chicago recently. So treating windows can help. Keeping cats indoors, particularly Chincoteague is another good example. There's a large feral cat colony in Chincoteague. So the fewer cats that are in particularly these coastal environments, the better for the resident and migratory and vagrant birds. So there's a lot of things that we can do, and maybe C or others have other things they'd like to add.
I think this is a point that you've made very clearly, Jordan, but one thing that can help with seabirds in particular is being a noisy birder. So seabirds face an invisibility problem. Unless you go out to see them, people never get to see a shearwater or an albatross. They never have that opportunity. So if you are someone who is excited about marine birds in particular, make some noise. When you show up to the dock, make sure that the hotel that you're staying at or the restaurants that you're eating at know that you are in their community spending money because of the birds that might not be visible all the time, but are an important part of your logic in visiting their community. You can also get involved in nesting protection. So that could be relatively close to home, that could be far away. ABC and other organizations are working hard to preserve nesting places, and all of us could use your help.
Yeah, great point, C, especially because that highlights that there are honestly so many things that people can do. Honestly, it's almost overwhelming because there's a long checklist of really valid options for everyone, whether you're 5 or 85 that you can do. Again, as Dan mentioned, teaching your children to keep your cats indoors or safely contained outside is something that a 5-year-old can actually learn. As an 85-year-old, bequests and planned giving are really important for continuing conservation efforts into the future, along with, again, picking up plastic, as Chloe keeps mentioning. So everything is valid and genuinely helps birds and make sure that habitat is home. So one of the other things that I wanted to ask is just what is your go-to tip for all of these things? Do you have any tips for making sure that people really get hooked on those tips? And have you had any success with the wording of certain suggestions? Chloe, especially for you. A lot of folks are very concerned about animals that have been, again, from the pictures, just in terms of being part of that trash, not just around it. Do you have anything that has really worked for getting people to take action?
I'm trying to think. People are just so passionate about birds, especially where I am. So it hasn't been too hard to get people excited about them. It's really fun to see kids get excited about nature and wildlife. Mostly what we do is with kids. So yeah, I'm trying to think. One exciting thing I should have mentioned in my talk is that since Splash started, there hasn't been any more recorded entangled oyster catchers at one of our most prominent sites. The Gulf Coast Bird Observatory was doing a research study there, and they used to find a ton of entangled oyster catchers. And then the last one they found was the month we started. And so since then, there have been no more entangled oyster catchers recorded on Texas City Dike. So stats like that really help get people passionate about what we do. And yeah, that's
good. Thanks for sharing that. That's fantastic to
Thank
know.
you.
Dan and C, can you share any commentary on vagrants seeming to be more in the news? Does that mean that there are more vagrants happening? Are there any other bird trends that you could comment on?
I think that vagrancy is a pattern that's been happening for a long time, whether we pay attention to it or not. And now, whether or not there are more vagrants, there certainly are more bird watchers looking for them and reporting them. And then our communication systems are better than they've ever been, with eBird, with all the different text services and messaging services that birds can communicate with each other. So I think we're just much more aware of vagrants and eagerly pursuing them when they occur. The one exception to all this is, I think, with climate change, we could expect more storms of more frequency and higher intensities. And so those might actually create more vagrancy. But I'm not sure if there's any documentation or quantification of that yet.
I would add to that, there are new pathways opening. The Northwest Passage, the Northeast Passage, from over the top of North America, over the top of Eurasia, is opening paths to seabirds that have not existed for the last 50,000 years. So there are new pathways opening with climate change. And again, I'll go back to the numbers game. Having the potential for establishing a new place is dependent on having the numbers in the historic range. So keeping populations healthy where they are now so that they can move to a safe place in the future is going to be key.
That makes me want to ask you a personal question of my own, which is, with all of these trends, with all of these individuals, the species movements and things, what are some of the biggest questions that you're most interested in right now? Because migration alone is a genuine phenomenon, let alone all of the incredible science and knowledge that we're still learning, especially with tracking and everything else. Are there any, just questions you can't help but wonder about when it comes to rare birds?
I can certainly speak to that, in that seabirds are unknown. They are the last frontier, as far as I'm concerned, for ornithology and birding. And so it's a shame to me that we are at this point of steep decline when we're just getting to know our neighbors. So every question is an open question when it comes to seabirds: where they go, what they're up to, how they're impacting the species around them, including ourselves. They're all open, and they're all just awaiting a good ornithologist, conservationist, a birder to get involved and share that enjoyment through conservation.
Thanks, Eve. Well, I just saw the time. Oh, yeah, Dan.
I think another question that's been in the chat a lot is sort of, when do you consider vagrants or eruptions, particularly limpkins or painted bunnings? And I think that's just a general open question that is really interesting, because I think we're seeing the emergence of new patterns and new distributions. And that's a really exciting thing to see in the future. And I think it'll mean different birds and different opportunities for birders to see in their local areas. And personally, I think for limpkins, I think we may be seeing the beginning of new patterns where Right now, they're considered vagrants, but looking back in hindsight, we may realize this is really an eruption phenomena when wetlands are dry in Florida and there's more limpkins. Those birds are moving north. And I suspect there's more limpkins because they're predating invasive snails and have more food maybe than they once did.
I definitely feel like we have more questions than answers right now when it comes to birds, but it's all very exciting and there's always so much to learn. So definitely have to stay tuned and keep following for more information and exciting, cool facts, but also then again, that really important action and conservation that helps protect all of these birds. So unfortunately, our webinar is quickly coming to a close. So I want to make sure to ask one last question of all of our speakers today. And that is, what is one thing that you hope that everyone takes away from this webinar and shares with a friend? So Dan, if you want to go first.
Sure. I will shamelessly say that I think everyone at this webinar should join ABC if you're not already a member. And if you are, you should gift a membership for one of your best friends. You'll get information about bird conservation issues. You'll get more engaged, you'll get more informed, and you'll do good for birds in the world.
Thanks, Dan. And C?
Your enthusiasm matters. Your storytelling matters. So you talking about your fantastic birding experience with a vagrant or with your backyard birds matters for birds conservation. And yeah, so get out there, enjoy yourself. And that by itself is making a difference.
There is no I in floxy. Chloe.
I would just say that everybody everywhere can make a difference for birds. That's it.
It's short and sweet and couldn't be more true. Thank you, Chloe. So with that, we now will end the webinar. Thank you so much again for joining us. Again, reminder that registrants will be getting a link to the recording via email in just a few days, and it'll be posted on YouTube as well. All of the work that you've heard about today is made possible thanks to ABC supporters. So again, thank you so much to all of our members and donors and people in the audience in general. If you would like to support more critical bird conservation across the Americas, please consider donating to ABC's Habitat is Home one-to-one match campaign. Generous ABC donors have already committed $500,000 and ABC is working to match that so that together we can do even more to conserve wild birds in their habitats. Please visit abcbirds.org/help-habitat or scan the QR code on the slide with your phone and make a donation today. Thank you so much for caring about birds and sharing ABC's mission to conserve them. I hope you all get to see a very exciting vagrant sometime soon. Thank you so much again.